Karen was still on the porch screaming into her phone when her dream home split in half and slid straight into the flood she helped cause. That's not hyperbole, that's physics. And karma. You see that land she built on? It wasn't hers. It was mine, my family's for generations. And when she tried to erase that with blueprints and smug smiles, the mountain remembered. This isn't a story about paperwork. It's a story about what happens when arrogance meets old earth. Will she get away with it or drown in what she created? I was halfway through fixing a busted irrigation valve when I found the envelope. Clean white, gold lettering, thicker than the usual junk. At first, I thought it was another wedding invite from one of my cousins who treat rural Texas like a scenic backdrop for Instagram vows. But no. This one had a name that made my stomach tighten like a coiled hose. Willow Hills Homeowners Association. Now, that might not mean much to you, but to a guy who lives outside town limits on land passed down from a grandfather too stubborn to sell and too smart to lose, it felt like someone had just slapped a barcode on my forehead. I wasn't part of any HOA. Hell, my closest neighbor was a goat named Turbo, and even he kept to his side of the fence. The letters said I was now subject to community development oversight under updated municipal planning zones, which is HOA speak for, we're stealing your land and gaslighting you about it. Curious turned into cold fury when I flipped to the second page and saw the map, bright colors, fake smiles, and something called Willow Hills Expansion Phase 2. And right smack in the middle of that blue sky fantasy, my family's property outlined like it had always belonged to them. I rubbed my eyes, hoping I was seeing things. I wasn't. They'd drawn roads through my pasture, sidewalks over my berry rows, and even a damn fountain where my shed currently stood, complete with a fake duct. I don't know what kind of twisted psych ward these people thought they were running, but that shed had been there since my grandpa built it with his bare hands during the Eisenhower administration, and it sure as hell wasn't zoned for ornamental poultry. So I did what any rational man with a mild case of inherited rage would do. I drove straight to the next town hall meeting, sat through 20 minutes of budget nonsense about potholes before they got to community expansion. And that's when I saw her, Karen Delacour, HOA president, hair like a helmet, smile like a guillotine. She stood there with a laser pointer and said my land was now part of the greater vision for regional harmony. I stood up and asked, real polite, when exactly my grandfather signed off on this harmony. She blinked like I was speaking goat. Then she said, "Oh, that? Clerical error? Happens all the time." Which is odd because last I checked, a clerical error doesn't come with bulldozers and pre-approved building permits. I left that meeting feeling like I'd walked into a real estate twilight zone. But it got worse. 2 days later, strange men with reflective vests started pacing my fields like they were picking plots for their summer homes. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They just measured, staked flags, and one guy even had the audacity to eat a granola bar while standing on the old irrigation pump my granddad installed. I told him to Lisa, "We're working with the HOA. You can call the office." "Yeah, sure. And I can also mail a letter to Santa while I'm at it." Then came the cherry on top, a huge laminated flyer pinned to my gate, complete with digital renderings of luxury hilltop living at Willow Hills, Phase 2. It had smiling families, dogs, and what looked like yoga on my hayfield. I stared at it for a good 5 minutes before it hit me. They weren't asking for my land. They'd already decided it was theirs. I didn't know it yet, but that was the day the war started, not with bullets, with blueprints. And somewhere deep under my boots, I swear I felt the damn groan. 3 days later, I got my first real face-to-face with Karen Delacour, and trust me, no amount of HOA mailers can prepare you for the full force of her presence in 3D. She drove up to the edge of my property in a brand new white Range Rover, parked like she owned the entire zip code, and stepped out in heels more suited for a mall than a pasture. She looked around like she was expected to be greeted by a landscaping crew. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked over. She extended her hand like I was a waiter at a garden party and chirped, "You must be Caleb. We've heard so much about you." I stared at her like she'd just complimented a hornet's nest. She launched straight into it, talking about regional beautification, legacy integration, and some nonsense called modern stewardship. Every phrase sounded like it had been pulled from a corporate brochure about eco-conscious gentrification. She talked a lot about collaboration, which in this context clearly meant you give up everything and we give you a Home Depot gift card. I asked her point blank why her little kingdom thought it could just absorb private land, and she didn't miss a beat. Smiled and said, "Oh, sweetie, the updated municipal zoning includes your acreage. It's all in the maps. There was a survey correction last quarter. Happens more than you'd think." I told her I had original deeds signed by a judge in 1964. She patted my arm like I was a confused grandpa, then said, "We're not here to fight. We're here to grow together." And she reached into her tote bag and handed me a brochure titled Willow Hills, Where the Past Meets the Possible, complete with a digital rendering of my barn turned into a yoga pavilion. I swear one of the stick figures was doing downward dog on top of my compost pile. I thanked her through gritted teeth and walked away before I channeled my inner Texas and turned that glossy pamphlet into a paper cut of vengeance. The next morning, I woke up to a brand new sign staked in the center of my yard: future site of Willow Hills Clubhouse, Phase 2 groundbreaking, summer 2025. Underneath it in fine print, no trespassing, HOA development zone. I stood there in my boxers and boots, coffee in hand, staring at a sign telling me not to enter my own damn land. I called the sheriff. He told me it was a civil matter. I called the zoning office. They said they'd get back to me. I called Karen. She sent me straight to voicemail with a message that sounded like it had been recorded at a wine tasting. So I did what any rational man would do. I tore the sign out, broke it over my knee, and built a fire with it. That night, someone threw a fresh sign back over my fence. This one laminated. That's when the notices started. One taped to my mailbox: unregistered vehicle on premises, referring to my 1987 pickup that hasn't moved in a decade and is technically a lawn ornament. Another cited me for excess vegetation accumulation, which I think meant my hayfield was being too grassy for their taste. A third accused me of operating a non-permitted agricultural facility. That's HOA code for you have chickens. I don't know if Karen was writing these herself or training squirrels to deliver them, but they just kept coming. I started pinning them on the side of the shed like trophies. By week's end, it looked like a conspiracy theory wall, all red ink and laminated threats. Then came the offer. A man in a suit too tight for summer weather came to my porch and handed me a contract. It was Karen's generous buyout, $82,000, 0 cents, for 14 acres of prime mountain land and a historic dam built with more backbone than her entire HOA board combined. I told him I'd think about it. He smiled like he'd already won and drove off. I walked back into my house, poured myself a whiskey, and sat down at my kitchen table. I unfolded the contract again and stared at the fine print for a while. Then I grabbed a red Sharpie, scrawled "Bite Me" across all 3 pages, and mailed it back Priority Express. That was the moment I stopped hoping they'd leave me alone. I knew they wouldn't, and the land, it knew too. Somewhere beneath my feet, the dam gave a slow, tired groan, like it was remembering how to be angry. The bulldozers came on a Tuesday, I remember, because I had just brewed a fresh pot of coffee and was halfway through oiling the chains of my grandfather's old gate when I heard that familiar diesel roar. I walked to the top of the ridge, mug in hand, and there they were, 3 yellow machines chugging into my fields like they were headed to a demolition derby. No heads up, no permits, just men in hard hats pretending my family's land was a sandbox. They started carving roads right through the pasture where I learned to ride a horse, the same dirt my granddad broke his back leveling with a hand plow. They plowed right through our old pear trees, uprooted the berry bushes I used to raid as a kid, and I swear to God, one of them flattened a rusted lawn chair that had been sitting there since the Reagan administration. It was like watching someone burn your childhood scrapbook page by page and then applaud themselves for the lighting. I called my lawyer, Rick Summers, who had the charm of a retired rodeo clown and the paperwork brain of a hawk. Good man, sharp, but when I showed him the maps the HOA had filed and the names attached, his eyebrows climbed high enough to qualify for a passport. He got quiet, said things like, "This might go deeper than we thought," and "these permits were fast-tracked unusually quick." Translation: someone's greasing palms behind closed doors. We filed a complaint with the zoning board. It mysteriously disappeared, filed again, got a response saying they couldn't locate original parcel data I drove down there myself only to be told their systems were under maintenance indefinitely. I asked if that maintenance included shredding legal documents in the break room. Meanwhile, Karen kept smiling. Every time I protested, she acted like I was a child throwing a tantrum over a toy. This is progress, Caleb, she'd say, like I was too simple to appreciate suburban sprawl and high-end cul-de-sacs. One time, she even brought me cookies. Oatmeal raisin, the cruelest cookie. I told her where she could shovel, politely, of course. But she wasn't here to feed me. She was here to gloat. Her little army of board members followed her around like Labradors in matching blazers, nodding along to every passive-aggressive speech she made about community uplift. One even had the gall to tell me I should be grateful. They were beautifying this neglected space. My land, my dam, my memories. And they called it neglected, like it was some moldy bathroom tile. The worst part wasn't the construction or the noise or even the fact that my well pump got yanked out by mistake and they told me to file a maintenance request. It was the banners. Big, glossy, billboard-sized banners strung across my fences, boasting coming soon, luxury craftsman homes starting at $799,000, 0 cents, with illustrations of cartoon families walking dogs and drinking wine on balconies that sat where my grandfather's smokehouse used to be. They even added a tagline, modern living meets mountain charm. I swear, every time I saw that slogan, I wanted to staple it to someone's forehead, preferably Karen's. But instead, I just kept collecting evidence, photos, drone footage, GPS tags, time-stamped in recordings. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to protest. I was going to watch and wait. Then one afternoon, I heard a different kind of rumble. Not from the bulldozers this time. This one came from the dam, a low, gravelly growl, like something old shifting in its sleep. I hiked up the ridge and saw it, a deep scrape in the outer wall. A chunk of compacted stone torn open, not catastrophic, not yet, but like a pulled thread on a fraying sweater. I followed the gouge with my hand, heart sinking. Some idiot with a backhoe had taken a bite out of the foundation without realizing it. That dam had held back the wrath of this mountain for generations, and now it was wounded. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about land. This was about memory, legacy, and the raw, stupid arrogance of people who think concrete is stronger than nature. Karen didn't just pick a fight with me. She picked a fight with the mountain. And the mountain, oh, it was just getting warmed up. By the end of that week, I stopped trying to fight them head on. Not because I gave up, but because I realized I was bringing a pitchfork to a poker game where everyone else was playing with marked cards. Karen had her claws in every pocket of that county, from the zoning board to the real estate commission. And I'd file a complaint and they'd lose it. I'd resubmit and they'd tell me the issue had already been resolved. Result by who? Karen, probably. She smiled like a stepmom in a Disney movie. Always just one lemon bar away from world domination. So I took a breath, stepped back, and let them think they'd won. I started saying thank you when her minions walked across my land in their loafers. I stopped attending town meetings. I even waved back when Karen rode past in her white Range Rover like a queen, inspecting her stolen kingdom. But while they built dreams out of plywood and fantasy, I was building something far stronger, a record. Every day, I documented everything. I took pictures of construction violations, gutters installed backwards, drainage pipes dumping straight into my field, concrete trucks leaking oil near creek beds. I recorded conversations with workers, contractors, HOA board members. I saved every notice, every smugly worded HOA letter, and backed it all up in 3 hard drives, 2 cloud servers, and a dusty filing cabinet my granddad once used for deer tail. I found permits that didn't line up with survey maps, environmental impact reports that had been clearly copy-pasted, and zoning waivers with signatures that looked suspiciously identical. At night, I'd sit in the old tool shed behind the dam, surrounded by piles of evidence, drinking strong coffee and stronger intentions. It wasn't revenge yet, it was preparation. And Karen, she had no clue. She was too busy holding champagne ribbon cuttings on half-poured sidewalks and bragging about record home pre-sols to a local reporter who thought concrete cured in a day. Then came the cookout. The HOB threw a block party to celebrate the so-called completion of Phase 2. complete with bounce houses, live music, and free tote bags that said Willow Hills Elevated Living. They held it on the hill above the dam, on top of unstable soil, on a slab of concrete poured over a drainage path. I watched from the tree line like a ghost at my own funeral, watching people drink sangria on land my grandfather once said would turn to soup in a flood. One lady even commented on how cute the view was from up there. I almost shouted that the view included a damn disaster waiting to happen, but I kept quiet. That was the art of it. Patience. Not every war is won with noise. Some victories require silence and a very long fuse. The rains came early that year. Just a few days after the HOA's grand opening barbecue, clouds rolled in like slow, angry drums. I didn't patch the runoff culverts. I didn't clear the debris from the drainage channels. I didn't seal the widening crack along the shoulder of the dam, not because I was sabotaging it, but because I always had. My grandfather taught me every trick to protect that dam, and I simply stopped doing them. Nature would handle the rest. That's the thing about water. It doesn't negotiate, doesn't care about bylaws or brochures. It just looks for a way down. One morning, I stood at the edge of what used to be our orchard and looked across the future clubhouse side. A heavy mist clung to the field. The air smelled like wet clay and bad decisions. One of the new sidewalks had already shifted, just slightly, a hairline crack from end to end. The HOA blamed the seasonal humidity. I blamed physics. The land was shifting, breathing, remembering. I walked back up to the dam that night, flashlight in hand, boots sinking slightly into softened earth. I didn't touch a thing. I just stood there, listening. The dam creaked beneath me, slow and tired, like an old dog growling in its sleep. And in that moment, I knew something Karen never would. You don't own the land just because you printed a map. The mountain doesn't care who's on the deed, it only cares who listens. The first storm was just a taste. Soft rain, moody clouds, the kind of weather that makes retirees bake banana bread. But even that was enough to stir the ground like a stomach growl before a fight. I watched puddles form in places they hadn't in decades. Along the sidewalks Karen had paraded as eco-integrated, near the fake creek they built with blue gravel, and especially at the base of the ridge, where water used to flow free before they paved over the runoff paths with stamped concrete. One homeowner knew, from California, I think, posted on Facebook about how cozy the rain sounded on your new roof. 3 comments down, someone replied with a photo of her basement feeling like a fish tank. Karen, ever the spin doctor, released a newsletter blaming climate anomalies. Yeah, okay, lady, it's not climate change when your cul-de-sac turns into a koi pond because you laid pipe over a floodplain and hoped for the best. Then came the real rain, the kind that doesn't fall. It slams. Like the mountain was having a tantrum and each raindrop was a fist. It came in waves, cold, mean, and endless. I sat on my porch with a thermos of coffee and watched the water pool where the HOA had installed ornamental trees, now half tilted like drunk parade floats. The freshly sodded lawns peeled up at the edges, sliding down into the streets in big floppy mats. One guy actually tried to stake his lawn back into place, like that would stop the mudslide creeping toward his Tesla. Meanwhile, Karen was still doing interviews, swearing up and down that everything was under control. She used words like stormwater management system and temporary pooling events. I used words like screwed and inevitable. I took a walk up to the dam during a break in the downpour. The path was slick, the ground soft under every step. Water trickled out of seams that hadn't leaked in years. One part of the slope, where the backhoe had chewed into the outer shoulder, was visibly sagging now, like a bloated belly holding back a scream. I didn't touch a thing. I didn't need to. The damage was already done, and nature has no interest in mercy. As I walked back, I passed by one of the newly finished homes, porch light flickering, mailbox already rusty, and saw a family staring out the window like they were watching the end credits of a horror movie they didn't realize they'd bought tickets for. I almost waved. I didn't. What do you even say to someone who just spent $750,000 on future lakefront property and doesn't know it yet? Karen kept smiling through it all. I bumped into her at the gas station. Her Range Rover caked in mud up to the headlights, her hair pulled back so tight it looked like it was fighting to stay attached. She asked if I was coping okay with the inclement weather. I said, better than your topsoil. She laughed like I was joking. I wasn't. She told me they were bringing in a specialist to evaluate the drainage and offer a mitigation roadmap. I asked her if that roadmap included moving the entire subdivision off a geological time bomb. She didn't answer, just smirked and walked away. The arrogance was astonishing, really, like trying to argue with a tsunami using PowerPoint. That night, I heard it again, that low, rumbling groan, deep and steady, like the bones of the valley shifting in their sleep. The dam was speaking, and it wasn't whispering anymore. I sat in the dark with my coffee, watching lightning dance along the ridgeline. Each flash lit up the cracks creeping across the sidewalks, the streets buckling slightly where the earth had softened underneath. It was all happening faster than I expected, and yet not fast enough for them to notice or believe. The HOA held another emergency meeting the next morning, via Zoom, of course, where Karen told everyone to remain calm and trust the process. I smiled because I knew what the mountain had planned next. And spoiler alert, the process was about to be underwater. It started just before dawn, when the air went still, naturally still, like even the wind knew to keep its mouth shut. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and felt it in my bones before I saw it in the sky. The pressure had changed. You don't need a Doppler radar when the ground beneath your boots hums like a warning bell. The clouds weren't just dark, they were heavy, swollen with the kind of rain that doesn't fall. It hunts. And the mountain, old and tired as it was, had reached the end of its patience. I grabbed my flashlight, threw on my jacket, and headed up toward the dam, the trail soft and silent, like the world was holding its breath. The cracks along the dam shoulder were no longer hairline. They gaped like open wounds. Muddy water sprayed from them in steady pulses, each one stronger than the last. I stood on the ridge, soaked to the skin, and watched as one chunk of earth gave way with a sickening slurp. The slope heaved, shuddered, then let go. A breach. Not wide, not yet, but enough. Enough to start the chain reaction. Water burst through the gap like it had been waiting generations for this moment. First a stream, then a torrent, then a roar. Not the Hollywood kind, not an explosion. Something deeper, sadder, angrier, like the earth itself was grieving what had been done to it. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I stood there watching justice pour down the mountain as natural and unstoppable as gravity. The flood moved fast, too fast for warnings, too fast for sirens. It tore through the first row of homes like they were cardboard props in a community theater production. Porches snapped, windows blew out, SUVs floated like bath toys, the HOA's brand new dog park gone in seconds. The community welcome center exploded outward as the pressure hit, spewing brochures into the sky like confetti at a funeral. Karen's prized fountain, the one she insisted be modeled after Versailles, was ripped from its foundation and spun downstream like a spinning hubcap. And above it all, the storm kept hammering, like thunder was clapping in slow, mocking applause. Everything she built, all the smugness, all the corruption, all the phony progress, washed away in a single glorious sweep. I made my way to the high ridge, the only place still dry, and from there I could see the entire disaster unfold. Karen's house stood alone at the top of the cul-de-sac, perched like a fake temple above the chaos. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, it would hold. She was out on the porch screaming into her phone, probably yelling at God or Zillow or both. The water reached her lawn. Then it reached her steps. Then it reached the foundation and hesitated. Just long enough to let her think maybe she'd be spared. That's when the ground buckled. The house tipped like a ship, split clean down the middle, and one half slid into the flood with a groan so loud it silenced the storm for just a second. The other half followed in slow, shameful defeat. The Range Rover bobbed like a sad reminder that hubris doesn't float. Emergency crews showed up late, of course, they always do, wading through chest-height water, shouting into radios, stringing up tape that sagged in the rain like wet noodles. Some tried to pump the water out, some tried to redirect it. But the mountain didn't care. The water didn't care. Nature had no interest in their cleanup plans. It had delivered its verdict, and now it was watching the sentence play out. I didn't stick around. I walked back to my porch, boots soaked, heart steady. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat down like a man who just watched history correct itself. No vengeance, no rage, just quiet satisfaction. I'd warned them. I'd documented it. I'd followed every law, played every card right, and now the land had spoken. And Karen, she was finally listening, whether she liked it or not. The morning after the flood, the valley looked like a war zone built by decorators and destroyed by truth. Lawn chairs tangled in branches, mailboxes jammed into trees like angry exclamation points. Bits of fake shutters, pool floaties, and broken promises floated down muddy creeks that hadn't existed a week ago. And standing in the middle of it all, ankle deep in mud and mascara, was Karen Delacour, face blotchy, phone still in hand, trying to salvage what little narrative she had left. Local news vans swarmed the area like vultures, snapping photos of her Range Rover half swallowed by a sinkhole and broadcasting live from the wreckage of her luxury development. One headline read, "Suburban Dream Drowns in Negligence." Another was simpler, "Karen's Kingdom Collapses." It was, honestly, better than I'd imagined. She tried to sue me first, of course, claimed I'd neglected essential infrastructure maintenance. I sent her legal team a packet of documents, every warning I'd filed with the county, every timestamped letter, every ignored email marked urgent. I had receipts notarized and watermarked. I had backup files, drone footage, and statements from old-timers who remembered when the dam was built to save this valley, not decorate it. But her case folded faster than one of those HOA pamphlets that used to clog my mailbox. Then she sued the county, the builders, the zoning board, the weathermen. Hell, probably tried to sue gravity while she was at it. None of it stuck. The courts ruled it an act of God amplified by human arrogance. A quote I wish I could tattoo across the HOA charter. Meanwhile, homeowners who had bought into the dream of Willow Hills were suing Karen and the HOA for fraud, negligence, and property destruction. Turns out when you advertise flood-safe construction and plant solar lights on soil held together by vanity and duct tape, people get mad when their investment ends up in a swamp. Class action lawsuits piled higher than the sandbags they never got around to deploying. Insurance companies refused to pay out, citing Karen's own signed waivers and falsified environmental assessments. One adjuster reportedly laughed when he saw her name on the claim. Another said flat out, "You built on a floodplain and ignored a dam breach warning. That's not bad luck. That's stupidity." Karen's board members jumped ship one by one. Most filed for bankruptcy. A few tried to disappear entirely. One guy ended up selling timeshares in Florida. Another became a barista. I heard he cries every time it rains. By fall, Willow Hills was officially condemned. The state launched an investigation into every zoning decision tied to the project, and wouldn't you know it, a lot of envelopes had been passed under a lot of conference tables. Karen's emails were leaked. So were her donation records, private texts, and at least one very unfortunate voice memo where she called the residents of old farm zones a bunch of hill. That clip went viral. Someone remixed it into a country song. It hit 1 million views in 3 days. She lost her car, her house, her HOA title, and rumor has it, even her hair extensions during a particularly spirited deposition. Last I heard, she was living with a cousin 2 counties over and working part-time at a dry cleaner, still blaming everyone but herself. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Me, I stayed out of the spotlight. I didn't need applause. I had peace. While the lawyers and cameras tore through the bones of her empire, I walked the perimeter of what used to be my grandfather's fields. The streets were cracked. The lampposts leaned like crooked teeth, but the land, underneath all that mud and mess, was still alive, still mine. I filed the paperwork quietly, just as the law allows, petitioned for adverse possession. No one contested it. No one could afford to. Within months, the entire ruined development, lot by lot, acre by acre, was mine again, not stolen, reclaimed, not for profit, for memory. I didn't have to destroy anything. I just waited. And in the end, it all came home. The first thing I did when the land was legally mine again wasn't throw a party or pop a bottle. I grabbed my gloves and walked straight to the dam. The damage was brutal, but not beyond repair. The bones were still there. My grandfather's work had cracked, but it hadn't crumbled. It just needed hands that cared. I spent the summer hauling stone, packing earth, mixing concrete in an old wheelbarrow that squeaked like it was protesting the weight of legacy. A few old timers from town showed up to help, men who remembered the flood of '43, who remembered my grandfather when he was just a kid, with a shovel and a promise. No fanfare, no blueprints, just work. By the time we finished, the new dam wasn't pretty, but it was strong, stronger than anything that had come since. And it didn't need a ribbon cutting ceremony. It had the mountain's approval, and that was enough. Next came the land. I tore out every broken mailbox, every fake cobblestone path, every trace of HOA-sponsored landscaping that thought form mattered more than function. I let the creeks find their own routes again, let the grasses grow where they wanted, let the deer come back without fear of noise ordinances. I turned the cracked cul-de-sacs into garden rows. The retention pond Karen insisted would be a reflection oasis became an actual reflection pond, fed by the natural spring the developers had tried to pave over. No fences, no brochures, just dirt, sky, and a kind of silence you don't hear in neighborhoods with HOA meetings and dog poop committees. The land was healing. You could feel it under your boots, soft and forgiving in a way that made you want to walk barefoot just to say thank you. I built one thing new, a signpost. Solid cedar sunk deep into the soil right at the edge of the new gravel road. I carved it by hand, no fancy font, no pretension. It read, High Water Acres. We respect the land here. Below that in smaller letters, built by nature, protected by memory. It wasn't for tourists. It wasn't for resale. It was for me, for anyone who might come through that valley one day and wonder what had happened here and who had finally listened. It was a warning and a welcome and a promise that this land would never again be handed over to fools with maps and manicured lies. Let them sell condos somewhere else. This place had already been sold once to greed, and the down payment was blood. On the first crisp morning of fall, I brewed coffee, filled my old thermos, and hiked up to the top of the dam. The mist was still hanging low over the valley, gold and silver in the early light. Birds sang. The creek babbled like it was telling secrets. I sat on the stone wall, ran my hand over the freshly set mortar, and felt it. Not loudly, just enough. The scars were still there if you looked hard. The half-sunk mailboxes, the broken street signs poking out like forgotten tombstones. But they'd fade. Nature is patient. It reclaims everything in the end. I raised my thermos and made a quiet toast. To my grandfather, to the land, to every stubborn heartbeat that refuses to sell out for amenities. Let them call it primitive. I call it peace. Somewhere out there, Karen was probably still blaming the weather, still Googling lawsuit reversal deadlines and microwaving bitterness like leftovers. I didn't care. She'd built her empire on paperwork and ego. I rebuilt mine with patience and mud. In the end, hers sank. Mine stood, not because I fought harder, but because I remembered. The mountain doesn't need permission to teach a lesson. It only needs time. And when it speaks, you'd better listen, because the land always wins. Sometimes you don't need a lawsuit. You just need time and gravity. This story wasn't about revenge. It was about memory, about what happens when people treat land like a blank check and nature cashes it with interest. Karen thought progress meant pouring concrete over legacy, but she forgot one simple rule. The earth remembers, and when it's done being polite, it speaks in floods. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Patience doesn't mean weakness, and silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes the best way to win is to let the other side dig their own hole and wait for the rain. Thanks for sticking through to the end. If this story made you smirk, sigh, or fist pump in quiet satisfaction, hit that like button, drop a comment about the wildest HOA story you've heard, and subscribe for more real tales where karma doesn't knock, it kicks the damn door in.